My uncle works at Nintendo. Okay, that's a lie, he actually did marketing for the Ouya, but with a company as historic as Nintendo, there are more facts thrown about than Bill Nye, Neil deGrasse Tyson, and that duck professor at a spell-checking convention. If you want to learn more about the house that the Ice Climbers built, here are all the Nintendo facts you should know, starting with, well, where it all started. Things could have been different for Atari, who found themselves struggling but hanging on following the early 1980s American video game downturn. At one point, there was even talk between Atari and Nintendo about bringing the Famicom, the name for the NES in Japan, to the West. The system had been doing exceptionally well in Japan, and Nintendo was ready to see if the rest of the world might be interested. North America was naturally a part of that, but there was concern about being a virtually unknown Japanese company trying to market a product no one had ever heard of. Deciding they had nothing to lose, Atari nearly finalised a deal with Nintendo to release the NES under Atari's name. It was a done deal, Nintendo of America President Howard Lincoln would later say. Unfortunately, the resignation of Atari CEO Ray Kassar ground the deal to a standstill, and perhaps luckily for all of us, Nintendo eventually decided to go it alone. Next, did you know that Nintendo is in some way partly to blame for these two jabronis? Resident Evil didn't invent survival horror, but the groundbreaking 1996 hit cemented the genre with tropes that are not only still hallmarks of the franchise, but the standards of the genre itself. When you talk about the influences on Resident Evil though, it probably wouldn't exist without the NES. Capcom's own Sweet Home was released in 1989 as a horror movie about a film crew trapped in a haunted mansion with its very own tie-in game. A horror RPG with heavy emphasis on inventory management and careful strategy made for a relatively unique game on the Famicom, which unfortunately was never released here in the West. What's unusual is how influential the game would be years after its release. Directed by the great Tokuro Fujiwara, director of Ghosts and Goblins and producer of an obscure series called Mega Man, the Sweet Home game would live on well past 1989. In fact, when Resident Evil originally went into production, with Fujiwara as its producer, the game was originally planned as a remake of Sweet Home. Okay, next up, did you know that Shigsy is a bit of a devil? My other uncle, Shigeru Miyamoto-san, would direct Super Mario Bros. And The Legend of Zelda almost back to back. Two of the bricks that built the success of the NES and really shaped the entire landscape of gaming for the rest of time. However, his first work on a console game didn't even make it to the United States. Released in 1984 for the Famicom, Devil World benefited from Miyamoto's work as a designer and tasked players with travelling through a maze filled with demons. The game is basically a Pac-Man clone with crosses, Bibles, and the actual devil himself, and that's kinda why Nintendo never thought to release the game in the West. Given Nintendo's strict policies on religious content in their games, it's hardly surprising that Devil World didn't make it anywhere west in the 80s. But the fact that it didn't get a North American release until it came to the Switch in 2023 is still kinda shocking, considering who worked on it. What's most shocking of all though? 3D gaming in 1987. Really? Well, sort of. 3D gaming has come a long way in the last decade alone thanks to VR, but it's not as new a concept as you might think. Dating back to the middle of the 1800s, 3D technology as a concept has been around for decades, and in the past 75 years or so, we've seen it tried in a variety of forms. Sometimes it's incredible, like watching Avatar in a theatre with several libations inside you, other times it's just 3D. Everyone knows the 3DS as Nintendo's main attempt at 3D gaming, but it was far from their first. Their original attempt was a peripheral called the Famicom 3D system, and as you might guess from the name, it was exclusive to Japan, releasing there in 1987, almost 40 years ago. Nintendo was simply giddy with trying to release every peripheral that could conceivably be attached to a Famicom or NES. The Famicom 3D system is another experiment, and more fascinating, and while it did work with games like Rad Racer, it sold poorly in Japan and never came close to a release in the US or elsewhere. If you're Bret Hart, look away now. Did you know that depending on how many screws are on the back of your NES cartridge, you could be sitting on a game that's worth a significant amount of money? Like, silly money? Why does it matter? Well, if you're a serious collector, knowing the difference can be essential because the tiniest details often determine how much a collectible is worth. In the case of the NES, a game with 5 screws on the back is generally rarer than the 3-screw design the company would adopt just a couple of years into the console's worldwide run. Why did they do that? Well, no one really knows for sure, but we can guess that Nintendo simply decided that a 3-screw design was more cost efficient than the 5-screw method. There are 5-screw games for every NES title released before the middle of 1987, and there are versions of both or a selection of games that overlapped during the transition. Again, some of these are worth a lot of money, so if you have to second guess your investment, which you probably should, feel free to send some of that money to us instead so we can finally get a new F-Zero game off the ground. Right, time to get super. Yeah, just go ahead and reset the counter. Without F-Zero, we wouldn't have Mario Kart, which originally came from attempts at developing a multiplayer F-Zero. But thanks to Mario Kart, we may never get another F-Zero. And that's not just cynicism talking either. F-Zero artist and Captain Falcon designer Takeya Imamura recently suggested in an interview that given the cost of a new F-Zero game, and considering how ridiculously lucrative the Mario Kart franchise continues to be, another F-Zero release just doesn't seem to be in the works. I think it's because Mario Kart is Nintendo's most popular racing game and a new F-Zero game would cost a fortune, he said. What makes this unfortunate news simultaneously interesting is the fact that Mario Kart wouldn't have existed if not for the desire to take F-Zero's lightning fast speeds and complex futuristic courses to a multiplayer setting. This prototype didn't yield such a game, but it was the groundwork for what would eventually be Super Mario Kart. Released in the summer of 1992, Super Mario Kart began one of Nintendo's longest running and most beloved franchises that really tests how much you love your loved ones. Spoiler, not as much as you'd think. The arcade industry was still very prominent in the 80s and 90s despite home consoles becoming increasingly more relevant, and Nintendo opted to hedge their bets by releasing arcade cabinets that could play their best games. For the Super Nintendo in particular, that came in the form of the Nintendo Super System in 1991. Even as their consoles became a staple in tens of millions of homes across the world, Nintendo maintained their decades-old ties to the arcade industry. However, the Super System would sell very poorly, which is probably why you've never even heard of it. Estimates place the figure at around 1,200 sales, which is considerably lower than the 32,000 Play Choice 10 cabinet sales. Nintendo's NES arcade releases, the company moved in the years prior. If you were lucky enough to come across one of these cabinets, some of the SNES titles available included Super Mario World, F-Zero, twice in one video, Contra 3, The Alien Wars, and of course the classic, The Addams Family. This SNES cabinet was the final arcade system that Nintendo ever manufactured and distributed themselves, and is about as hard to find as you might expect, especially in good working order. Also, it's as big as a refrigerator, but you don't need to eat, right? Originally, the SNES was going to include full backwards compatibility with the NES library. While you may not care either way personally, I cannot live without my fat PS3. Backwards compatible consoles can at the very least make playing old favourites physically a whole lot easier. Unfortunately, with the exception of a couple of their consoles, Nintendo has never expressed much of an interest in this feature, or their consoles were just too different from each other for it to make much sense. They went from carts to tiny discs to big discs and then back to carts. Make your mind up, guys. But at one point, likely as a response to both Sega and PC Engine offering backwards compatibility with their consoles, Nintendo only abandoned their efforts when they realised that adding it would significantly raise their retail costs. It's too bad, but it's also true that it would have made the SNES pricier, which just wasn't viable as the battle with Sega was just starting to heat up. Nintendo was initially in no hurry at all to update the NES, even with competitors like Sega and NEC's TurboGrafx-16 planning bigger, stronger consoles. Nintendo was confident the NES would maintain strong sales as an integral part of the family home. However, while the TurboGrafx-16 wasn't a significant threat, with the marked superiority of the Genesis to the creaky NES, particularly with games that blew Nintendo away from a production value standpoint, Sega began to put a dent in Nintendo's dominance. It also helped Sega that they would launch the Genesis with an aggressive advertising campaign that went to Nintendo directly. A response became inevitable, and development of the Super Famicom was announced in late 1987 but wouldn't see a release until 1990 in Japan. By the time the SNES was released in the US and UK in 1991 and 1992 respectively, the Sega Genesis had been out for nearly 2 years in most major markets. If Nintendo had waited much longer before following up the NES, who knows, we might have been watching the Ristar or Dynamite Headdy movie back in 2023 instead of Mario. They took so much from us. They took so much. A child who uses the power of his imagination to try and escape from a brutal, violent, alcoholic stepfather. This is the main plot of the 1992 fantasy drama film Radio Flyer, and according to some executives from the 1980s whose cocaine hadn't yet run out, would translate into a pretty good licensed game in the 16-bit era. Radio Flyer, from what little we know of the game, would have seemingly been in the vein of a Pilot Wings sort of game, meaning you would be responsible for expertly manoeuvring and landing your vehicle to get away from your abusive stepfather. Would he be like chucking empty bottles of wine at you? Would you have to try like hammer A to shake him off your wing? How would this have worked? How would this have worked? We'll never know, either because someone actually realised that a video game based on a movie with such a harrowing topic was a fundamentally bad idea, or because the Richard Donner-helmed movie starring Elijah Wood bombed badly at the box office. Regardless of the actual reason, it was probably for the best. If you haven't played Hyperzone before, you're in for a good time if you like rail shooters. You'll also have a lot of fun with the game's hidden 3D mode, which even some of those who have played it before didn't know about. Developed by HAL Laboratory in 1991 as one of their earliest SNES releases, Hyperzone is an extremely addictive, highly underrated rail shooter whose Mode 7 graphics make you feel like you're playing a shooter spin-off of F-Zero 3 times in one video. We're spoiled. Across 8 frenetic levels buried inside Hyperzone is fascinating support for stereophonic 3D. The cheat code in of itself isn't new, but it wasn't until recently that people proved the mode could work with the right equipment. What's so interesting about this whole thing is the fact that HAL Laboratory did it at all. Remember that this is the very early 90s. HAL Laboratory simply wanted to prove what the SNES could do with the right peripheral, but said peripheral never materialized. We did get the Miracle Piano teaching system though, so yeah, that's good, isn't it? Yeah. There's not a lot we're super comfortable with saying about the Yakuza, apart from that we love the way Kazuma Kiryu works it. When they're not lighting up the dance floor, they have very strong opinions about how things should be run. Such was the situation with Nintendo, who were genuinely concerned that the Yakuza might hijack an incoming shipment of highly desired Super Nintendo consoles. This was a concern shared by Nintendo President Hiroshi Yamauchi and his advisor Hiroshi Imanishi. Enter Operation Midnight Shipping. Yes, that really is the name that was given to Nintendo's decision to sidestep any potential issues with the local gangs that might occur. While the name is at least kind of cool, even if it does call to mind your guilt-filled Amazon binges when you convince yourself that you do actually need 50 new tea towels at midnight, the actual mission simply came down to getting the shipments of the system, as well as copies of Super Mario World and F-Zero, 4 times? If we said it 4 times in front of a mirror, like a new F-Zero might like appear in front of our hands, give it a try, guys. Anyway, let's go back a bit, as well as copies of Super Mario World and F-Zero out to stores as early into the day as humanly possible. Whether or not Nintendo was being a little dramatic is up for debate, but the launch of course was a monumental success. We may never know what the Yakuza thinks of Super Mario World though, and that's a shame. Maybe they preferred Ristar. Maybe, we'll never know. The one peripheral designed to get your SNES online was the X-Band from Catapult Entertainment. A device that was also designed for Sega Genesis players, the X-Band in theory offered players the ability to not only get together online to play against friends, but also to download newsletters and even read email. Eventually, although X-Band would have an estimated 15,000 subscribers at its peak, and though it would get involved with the Sega channel at one point, it ultimately had to shut down in early 1997. Although guys, that's pretty neat, apparently your X-Band modem can still get either the Genesis or SNES online in the 2020s. The other major force that took the SNES online, or rather the Super Famicom, was the Satellaview. A collaboration between Nintendo and the satellite radio company Sento Giga that never left Japan, the Satellaview only required you to purchase the necessary equipment. You could then access the select hours in which broadcasts would be run that allowed players to download everything from new and old SNES games to magazines to various pieces of media and special events. Simpler, less angry times online. I think Jeeves may have actually been the anchor being for the whole internet. Number 9, Pretty Hate Mamma Mia Sheen. There's a lot of things we associate with the Oscar-winning Trent Reznor, but you probably know him for 9 Inch Nails. While a lot of people know he has been a long time video game fanatics, some fail to connect him to one of the most beloved games in Nintendo's history with a character named after him in Super Mario World. That's right, Mario's last name is Resnner. No, the ever-cheerful Trent Resnner didn't have anything to do with the game itself, but his work was an inspiration to one of the people responsible for the localization of the game. Also called the Bui in Japan, which means to make the peace sign, Resnner the Rhino got his name in the West because Nintendo employee Dave E. Brooks, working on the localization for Super Mario World, happened to be a really big music fan. This is also why all of the Koopalings, except Ludwig, were named after musicians who at the time were still alive. Resnner rhinos have appeared sporadically since Super Mario World, perhaps most notably in New Super Mario Bros. 2. There's even a Lego set featuring them. Isn't that cool, Trent? Thanks, Trent. Despite Nintendo themselves claiming that Sega's highly touted blast processing was nothing more than nonsense invented by Sega themselves, it turns out that not only was blast processing legitimate, but also something the SNES did before the Genesis. Introduced in Sega's marketing in 1992, the concept of blast processing very quickly became a talking point in magazines, and among those trying to settle the Nintendo vs Sega debate once and for all. While there's still some debate on what blast processing really means, the most likely explanation is that it refers to pushing data onto the graphics chip of the console while the scan line was being simultaneously drawn on the screen. If you can jive with that, then you'll be interested to know that Sculptured software developer Jeff Peters has claimed that his studio discovered how to achieve the blast processing effect in their port of Mortal Kombat for the SNES, long before Sega ever mentioned it in their marketing. However, in the case of the Genesis, blast processing's potential concerns graphics, whereas Jeff's claim concerns creating a process that allowed the developers of the port to maintain the best possible audio quality. You with me so far? I'm not sure I am. Besides the fact that Nintendo's only compilation album features a previously unreleased track by Roy Orbison, the 1991 MCA Records co-venture Nintendo White Knuckle Score in Hell, also includes a song that tried to promote literacy and Super Mario World at the same time. Whether or not the song was successful in doing those things is debatable, since the album seemed to come and go without making much fuss. Contemporary reviews didn't really know what to make of White Knuckle Scoring, except for the unreleased Roy Orbison song being the artist's first new song since his passing in 1988. But you can't deny the song by the band Jellyfish, written from the perspective of King Bowser and his naked rage at Princess Toadstool teaching Yoshi and his Koopaling children how to read, is pretty damn catchy. You have to take our word for it though, or look it up on YouTube itself. The album included a comic book that promoted Super Mario World while referencing this song, and it's the only song on the entire album that has anything to do with Nintendo. Is White Knuckle Scoring as good as WrestleMania the album though? We'll leave that up to the gods to decide. Turns out the SNES had more to offer than just Mode 7 graphics, as there were in fact 8 different modes available within the system. This is the video game equivalent of turning it up to 11. One of the main features touted for the SNES before and after its release was the addition of Mode 7 graphics. Simply put, Mode 7 refers to a mode of graphics in which the game's background layer can be rotated and scaled on a scanline to scanline basis to do all sorts of cool depth effects with the background of the game. Racing games like Mario Kart and F-Zero took full advantage of this, but you could also find Mode 7 examples in such games as Super Castlevania 4, Final Fantasy 4 and 6, and NHL Stanley Cup. While a pretty well-known element of what made the SNES unique, it wasn't the only mode. Numbered from 0 to 7, you can find games that used different modes across the SNES library. Mode 0, for example, was often used for screens of text, which was important in games like Final Fantasy 4. Mode 3, on the other hand, was rarely used for actual gameplay, but was often needed for title screens. Depeche Mode, meanwhile, are an English electronic band from Basildon. Number 13, the bizarre way SNES Family Feud checked your answers. Weird glitches in retro games is a sort of subject that never gets boring, and that includes the SNES. Some glitches can cause the game to freeze or become otherwise unplayable, such as Super Punch-Out freezing under certain conditions, but it can also yield completely insane playing experiences. Family Feud for the Super Nintendo, released in late 1993, is one of the weirdest examples we've ever heard of. What makes Family Feud unique, and perhaps even worth playing in the modern era, is its text parser. Rather than read an entire answer to determine whether or not you're right, it will only check to see if the letters of the answer are present in alphabetical order. So, if the game asks you to name something used only in winter and you spend 4,000 minutes manually typing in the all-weather shitter, the game will recognise that as heater. Your mileage for how fun this really is may vary, but we think personally some overdue Game of the Year awards are in order. Known in the West as BS, The Legend of Zelda Ancient Stone Tablets, with the BS of course standing for Big Sausage. No, it was broadcast to Teleview. This is the A Link to the Past sequel you never knew existed. Set several years after the events of the SNES classic The Legend of Zelda A Link to the Past, players once again take on the role of Link, who is now quested with gathering the ancient stone tablets. This is all done while learning more about the younger brother of a major NPC from the first game. In the modern era, this could easily be compared to some ambitious post-game content like DLC kinda. It was even released as different downloadable episodes via Teleview. Do you remember when every game was going episodic for a minute there thanks to Telltale? Well, Zelda did it first. By no means as long as the SNES game, Ancient Stone Tablets nevertheless gave players in Japan only a truly unique opportunity to expand on a beloved game and story. The game could only be played for an hour at a time through Teleview broadcasts that ran at certain hours for less than a month between March and April 1997, and you thought digital delisting was bad these days. Well, a very accurate facsimile has been created from dubbed material stored on memory packs. It's impossible to play the game in its original form. Let the sausage loose, Nintendo. Going back to when Nintendo dumped Sony midstream during a collaboration on what would have been a CD-ROM add-on for the Super Nintendo, which probably would have been a gigantic flop, fair to say. The relationship between the two companies has always been a bit frosty. We would love to make a documentary about this falling out. Please let us know down below if you're interested in watching like an hour on that topic. But that wasn't always the case, and you can even look at the many brilliant minds who worked on the system to see that future PlayStation 1 designer Ken Kutaragi designed the SCP-700 sound chip that would power the SNES console throughout its life. As the story goes, Kutaragi developed the chip without Sony's knowing, and it was an intervention from Sony President Norio Oka that not only prevented Kutaragi's firing, but also opened the door to a brief but profoundly important period of cooperation between Sony and Nintendo. While we remember a fierce rivalry between the two companies, particularly in the late 90s, Ken Kutaragi doesn't think of it that way at all. "We were workmates," he said in a recent interview, "but people outside didn't think so." How about you guys just bury the hatchets and make a Switch Station 2? Mario and Knack together at last. Combining beloved Mario characters with a collection of frantic minigames developed by Hudson Soft, Nintendo established another major franchise featuring everyone's favourite Italian plumber with the first Mario Party. They also created a situation that ended with them spending a ton of money on gloves that had to be included with every copy of the game. While this sounds like an urban legend, it seems to be true, as it was reported in numerous media outlets in 2000. You had to jump through a fair number of hoops to get your gloves, but apparently this was set up by Nintendo as a response to approximately 90 complaints received by the New York Attorney General's office, resulting in them apparently being asked to supply 1.2 million children with gloves while also potentially paying $18 million in damages. So, what happened? Players, namely children without Dorito dust being used as a protective barrier, experienced a plethora of hand injuries when they used their palms instead of their thumbs for some of the trickier minigames. We've all been there. Understandable? A bit. Smart? Not really. At least this wasn't a consistent issue for Nintendo with the sequels, probably because people realised that life is unfair and Mario Party is the least fair thing of all. Why burn off your hand skin just to get blasted by this asshole anyway? From 1080 Avalanche to the dinosaur planet that eventually became Star Fox Adventures, a number of significant GameCube games first began their life as titles for the N64. With a unusually high number of cancelled big-ticket games to its name, including Grand Theft Auto, a follow-up to Doom 64 that you can see more of in our cancelled Doom games video. Go watch that, it's pretty good. And most importantly of all, Freak Boy, the Nintendo 64 has a reputation for what could have been. While the system would see a long list of stellar games released during its lifetime, quite a few announced games failed to materialise for one reason or another. Though many of them never progressed beyond their N64 aspirations, a pretty huge chunk of legendary games transitioned from N64 releases to major titles for Nintendo's next system, the GameCube. In addition to 1080 Avalanche and Dinosaur Planet, some N64 games that instead came to the GameCube include Die Hard 64 in the form of the massively underappreciated whipper Die Hard Vendetta, Resident Evil 0, Eternal Darkness, Luigi's Mansion, Pikmin, and many others. There's something about that footage of Resident Evil 0 on N64 that really just hits different, you know? Here's another random fact for you. The Sega Dreamcast's unofficial mascot, Seaman, was originally pitched to Nintendo for the 64DD. Want to see more Dreamcast facts? Let us know down below. As it turns out, the idea behind the N64 controller having 3 handles wasn't that you were meant to take down Black Manta with them, but it was that you'd actually only ever use 2 of them. What we had with the N64's unique controller was 3 intended positions, and which ones you were going to use would depend on the game you were playing. So, for example, if you were playing one of the console's 2D titles, you would use the left and right handle. Most players and games utilise the middle and right handles, as these utilise the full range of movement provided by the analog stick. And the third option, the rarely used left and middle handles, were designed to emulate your keyboard and mouse, except it was rarely used because most players simply opted for the C buttons when it came to aiming, and also blaming the screen cheating when your mate dog walked you in Goldeneye anyway. If you wanted to play Japan exclusive games like Bangai-O, Sin and Punishment, or Last Legion UX, all you had to do was swap the back of your Japanese cartridge with whatever North American N64 cartridge you weren't particularly attached to. Rest in peace, Batman Beyond. The process can be completed in mere minutes, really. Sorry, Nintendo lawyers, we meant a really laborious process involving 2 Hunger Games, several $1 billion, and a blessing from at least like 6 monks up a Skyrim mountain. Now, while playing Japanese games on an NTSC console is a snap, PAL N64 owners will have a bit more trouble, that's me. If for some reason you really want to play UK exclusive games like Taz Express, what a banger, or Premier Manager 64, there's a bit more work involved. You can also just save yourself a significant amount of hassle, not to mention potentially damaging your N64, and just purchase a cartridge adapter. But where's the fun in that? Jack into the Matrix and then jack off some Premier Manager 64, just as Kevin Keegan would want. This one is almost too remarkable to be believed. Somewhere amidst the seemingly thousands of tiny and large mistakes Sega made during the 90s, there's a tidbit about the company having a chance to purchase and utilise the tech that would eventually power the N64, only to turn it down. By the early 1990s, which is when all true legends were born, Silicon Graphics was looking to get into the games industry. Their early impressive efforts at creating a powerful low-cost chip was first observed by Sega executives on the advice of Sega of America president Tom Kalinske, who saw serious potential in the chip. Unfortunately, in what proved to be one of the many examples of Sega's Japanese branch having a highly dysfunctional relationship to the American branch, Sega's Japanese executives turned down SGI's proposal. Twice. Even if the company made improvements to the chip, Sega's Japanese executives simply said they weren't interested. SGI later met with Nintendo, who proved to be very intrigued in the chip's potential. So really, we've got Sega to thank for Iggy's wrecking balls. Thanks, Sega. The N64 had the same relationship to arcades that the NES and SNES had, but not in quite the same way or as successfully. The Alex 64, nothing to do with your most annoying mate's favourite GoldenEye character, was even more niche than the Nintendo Super System and PlayChoice 10 before it. The Alex 64 would be released by Sata in collaboration with Nintendo exclusively in Japan. The hardware itself was based on Nintendo 64 hardware, and the idea was to create a number of arcade titles that would take the graphical and sound prowess of the console and expand on it in a meaningful way. Games started rolling out to Japanese arcades in 1998, and that was unfortunately as far as it ever really went. Few games were produced with this hardware, with the final releases coming out in 2003. What's interesting is that of the games made with Alex 64, 2 received North American N64 ports. Those would be Magical Tetris Challenge featuring Mickey and Star Soldier Vanishing Earth. There's unfortunately been no word on Vivid Dolls ever coming over here though. I mean, if Nintendo wants to make the Switch 2 sell 200 million units? Released to the N64 in the year 2000, which was 75 years ago if you can believe it, many consider WWF No Mercy to be the best wrestling game of that console generation. Some old school fans will even insist it's still the best wrestling game of all time, and with the recent absolutely incredible No Mercy mod called WWF Legends Challenge 64, you can play what is arguably the best possible version of one of the best wrestling games ever made. This mod does more than simply swap out the fantastic No Mercy roster for a fantastically deep array of 80s and 90s wrestling legends though. Everything from graphics to sound to the crowd cheering you on has been upgraded, while still retaining the vibe of a late 90s, early 2000s wrestling game from THQ. And of course, ASI. WWF Legends Challenge 64 isn't the only No Mercy mod on the block, but it's arguably the best. And it's not that hard to install either. I mean, it's a little bit of work, but it'll be worth it. If you've been waiting for a pure, endlessly entertaining old school wrestling game that isn't AEW Fight Forever, what happened there, you're going to be in heaven. Born out of a desire to combat substantial software piracy in China, the IQ player from Nintendo and their Chinese counterpart, IQ, is a fascinating piece of tech upon closer examination. Instead of a console with controllers, the IQ player basically boiled the entire N64 system down into something that could fit on the IQ player's oversized controller, which served as the console itself. As plug and play systems went, it was pretty impressive, with games and data being made available on 64MB flashcards that you could download and store. Games made available on the IQ included Super Mario 64, F-Zero X, yes, F-Zero mention, Paper Mario, Yoshi's Story, and several others. However, what was noticeably different about the IQ player was that it had considerably better online connectivity, which makes sense as the system was released over 7 years from the N64's debut. You could also get an IQ Game Boy Advance, DS and 3DS, and IQ or even the guys behind the N64 emulator for Nintendo Switch Online. Thanks for reviving Iggy's Wrecking Balls, guys. Star Fox 64 is still a lot of fun to play and is one of the console's games that have aged the best. If you find yourself firing it up sometime soon, take a moment to discover the on-foot section of the game that a shockingly high number of people still don't know about. While it doesn't unlock any new sections of the main storyline as it's limited to multiplayer mode, the on-foot mode for Star Fox 64 does add a whole new dimension to the inherent mayhem of blasting your friends into cosmic dust. On-foot mode is also one of the most difficult unlockables of its time. No, you don't need anything special to unlock it, but good luck getting it anyway. You'll need to beat the game in normal mode and earn every single medal on every single planet. Then you do that again on hard mode. If that doesn't take the rest of your life, you'll then unlock the on-foot mode. Was it worth it? That's entirely up to you, but the answer should probably be no though, considering even if you told everyone at school about your accomplishment, they probably wouldn't believe you. The whole talk to this character 100 times to evolve your Pikachu into Mew Myths from the Pokemon Yellow days made cynics of the best of us. By the way, Dan Jacobs, I will have my Magneton back, my shiniest of Magnetons. I will have my vengeance. If you don't remember the infamous PS3 Boomerang controller unveiled by Sony at E3 2005 to the delight of virtually no one, tasteless cowards, it probably won't mean as much to you that a third-party hardware manufacturer got there years early for the N64. The PS3 controller looked interesting, but even Sony PlayStation designer Teyu Goto, the man who designed the original PS1 controller as well as this new boomerang design, admitted the controller was built more around provoking a visual response than being ergonomically friendly, because yeah, if you're looking at it, it's making me very emotional. You can take a wild guess how the third-party Boomerang 64 controller from Newbie was received then. Reviews say you're going to be finding your body at a weird angle for most games that require two hands, with any button mashing leading to agony. The button layout also renders the Boomerang 64 functionally useless at times, with the D-pad and analog being way too close together for any game that requires you to use both of them. It looks neat and is something to show your friends and laugh at, and that's about it. A novelty controller that's pretty much unfit for usage and will kill your hands, yeah, you better believe it's not cheap. From 1993 to the late 2000s, tens of thousands of airline seats and hundreds of thousands of hotel rooms around the world came with the ability to play a Nintendo console on the go. Beginning with the SNES, the Nintendo Gateway system was an ingenious effort by Nintendo to extend the range of places where you could find their games. The venture was seemingly very successful, since Nintendo would partner with numerous airlines and hotels over the course of more than 15 years. Partnering with LodgeNet, Nintendo would eventually expand this concept to include systems like the Game Boy. In 1999, LodgeNet and Nintendo added N64 games like Wave Race 64 and Super Mario 64 to their offerings. Some games featured unique bits of content, such as Paper Mario having an extra screen that warned players that hitting reset would delete their saved data. Whoa. Much of this media is now considered lost, but much of the N64 library has been found. It was even a thing with the GameCube. But obviously, it couldn't be with the Wii because the motion controls in international space would probably cause an incident of some kind. By international space there, I mean not actual space, I mean airspace. Space! While Spielberg himself has never mentioned the game, the 2012 Jamie Russell book, Generation Xbox: How Video Games Invaded Hollywood, does offer a story that when Spielberg pitched a video game to DreamWorks inspired by his 1998 film Saving Private Ryan, a game that would eventually be called Medal of Honor, rest in peace, he cited GoldenEye for the N64 as an inspiration. The book further states that this came about from watching his son and his friends playing GoldenEye. Spielberg ultimately wanted a World War II game that would offer a similar experience, while simultaneously teaching them about major events in the conflict. While Spielberg himself has not confirmed the story, we can safely assume that given how much the guy seems to love video games and how much he wanted an N64 in particular, it's at least safe to assume he had the console and game in his home. It would be nice to get confirmation from the guy himself, but it makes a lot of sense that Medal of Honor would draw inspiration from the first-person shooters of the day. GoldenEye would naturally be at the top of such a list. We did actually get a Wii exclusive from Spielberg by the name of Boom Blocks that became a bit of a household hit, as well as a sequel that few people seem to remember. The Super Game Boy proved to be a pretty successful add-on for the SNES, allowing people to play Game Boy games on their TV with a special cartridge. What people may not realise is that this was part of a practice and peripheral that Nintendo had been making since the days of the original Famicom. Retailing for as much as $1,400, the Wide Boy was built to allow developers and gaming press to study Game Boy games on a larger TV. This was also how screenshots of Game Boy games were obtained. I did always wonder how they did that back in the day without, easily found capture cards, so the more you know. The last iteration of the Wide Boy would be the Wide Boy 64, which eventually got an upgrade that allowed you to play Game Boy Advance games as well. There were also some third-party products that promised the same experience, but the results aren't spectacular. Emulation has made all of this a bit unnecessary really, but if you want a peripheral for your N64 that shares its name with a term used to describe a British con artist in the 1930s, and you've got a few grand lying around that you are just going to use for the fireplace this winter anyway, the Wide Boy 64 is a natural purchase. Generally, when a console generation ends, that's typically the end of the console itself. Apart from, apparently, the PS4, which is honestly probably going to keep getting games for the next 5 years. Nintendo has famously supported its systems long after they've stopped publishing games, but it's still weird when you discover that Nintendo supported the SNES for at least a little while longer than they supported the N64. At least as far as Japanese players were concerned. released in Japan in the summer of 1996, calling the N64 a failure in its native country would be a bit of an understatement really. Lacking a decent range of RPGs, or really any that were worth playing, the N64 failed spectacularly where the Famicom and Super Famicom succeeded brilliantly. So much so that whereas the Super Nintendo continued to receive support until the year 2003, with the last official SNES game in Japan coming out all the way in the year 2000, the N64 finished its Japan run in 2001 with a different Bomberman 64 and was officially discontinued in 2002. That's a much shorter lifespan than the SNES, but again, when you consider that just 17% of the N64 sales came from Japan, it makes sense. Freak Boy could have fixed everything. Across 4 years and counting at time of writing, lost media historian and YouTuber L Supersonic Q has waged a maddening campaign to track down an early example of a livestream event that promoted the recently released Super Smash Bros. For the N64. We can only hope he's eventually successful, as this has become one of the most well-known lost media hunts in recent memory, and also the man is going a bit insane. Dubbed Slamfest 69, you wish, 99, the event was organised by Nintendo and held at the MGM Grand Adventures theme park in Las Vegas, Nevada on April 24th, 1999. My little sister was born just 4 days before that. Don't look up what else happened on that day. The wrestling match was either a tag team brawl featuring Mario and Yoshi squaring off against Donkey Kong and Pikachu, or a 4-way match featuring the same characters. Regardless, first-hand accounts say the fight ended in a draw, but that the actors in giant suits managed to put on an athletic, entertaining contest. Yeah, it's probably no Shinsuke Nakamura versus Zayn at NXT TakeOver Dallas, but it's probably better than watching like 99.999% of Val Venus's matches. On paper, it all sounds like a pretty standard, albeit fun, Nintendo promotional event, yet the extraordinary obscurity of the media itself has given Slamfest a certain legendary status. Online gaming was possible during the GameCube era, but the list of games that support the function could be counted on one hand. Homeland and powerful Pro Baseball 10 offered online play only in Japan, while Sega's 3 GameCube releases of MMORPG Phantasy Star Online all supported online play. As an alternative, the GameCube did allow LAN play too, provided players were able to provide the TVs and extra consoles required to make a LAN session work. Even then though, only 1080 Avalanche, Kirby Air Ride, Mario Kart Double Dash, banger, and Homeland offered LAN play. However, back in 2003, some enterprising young modders managed to convert LAN into online play. An Indiana University student by the name of Chad Paulson, because of course his name was Chad, had become annoyed with the fact that there were mostly only LAN-enabled GameCube games when his friends didn't live in Indiana, so he decided to make his own solution. Working with a group of like-minded individuals, Chad and the lads managed to create Warp Pipe Alpha, which utilised the universal plug-and-play architecture of the GameCube to essentially spoof a LAN game over the internet. Sure, there were a few extra steps that our brain is much too small to understand, like connecting the GameCube to a router and then connecting the router to a PC with Warp Pipe Alpha installed, but the results speak for themselves. In a way, Warp Pipe Alpha could be seen as a precursor to initiatives like Parsec or Steam Remote Play, which aim to make local multiplayer games online enabled. The GameCube's teeny tiny discs have become one of the most enduring and iconic aspects of the entire console's legacy, even if a large number of people apparently didn't know that you could press the middle button to eject the disc. It says push on it, guys. If you've been guilty of yanking a GameCube disc out from the edge and cracking the inner rim in the process, consider this your bonus fact of the video, but you probably could have done with it 20 years ago. Anyway, while Xbox and PS2 had adopted DVDs as their method of physical distribution, cute and quirky Nintendo decided to opt for tiny discs instead. But what if there was a GameCube out there that managed to take DVDs as well as regular GameCube discs? Well, there was one of those, but only in Japan. Nintendo partnered with hardware manufacturers Panasonic to create the Panasonic Q, a version of the GameCube that included a regular-sized disc tray allowing for DVD and audio CD playback alongside the regular functions of a GameCube. The design is a total departure from the legendary look of the normal GameCube, with the Panasonic Q looking like a space-age toaster with an LCD screen, but this particular model has become something of a collector's item in recent years thanks to its stainless steel case and unique features. Less than 100,000 units of the console were sold, either because this model was only available in Japan or because it was being sold for a higher price than a GameCube and a DVD player combined. Yes, you better believe that this is a collector's item now, and a pricey one at that, owing to the rarity and how rare it is to find them in proper working order. Q, for you, is watching Van Wilder on your GameCube really worth it? Do you remember those halcyon days when you had to store all of your saved games on a memory card, often being forced to make agonizing decisions on what saves to keep when you buy a new game? Sometimes you have to make sacrifices to get what you want, and sometimes that sacrifice is deleting your Tony Hawk's Pro Skater save in order to make room for your new Sims family. Those games ate blocks like I eat your always positive comments for breakfast in the morning. The early days of the Nintendo GameCube led to a memory crisis, with Nintendo and other third-party manufacturers creating memory cards with much bigger space for all your games to fit. However, these memory cards came with their own sets of problems. Nintendo released the 1019 memory card, which basically quadrupled the amount of memory players could have access to, but in a statement on Nintendo's official website, the company delved into the issues that could arise from the memory card's usage. For starters, playing backyard football could straight up wipe your memory card and a few numbers off your IQ, while playing Sonic Adventure 2 Battle with a fresh 1019 memory card would cause the number of free blocks to display incorrectly. Also, the memory card can only hold 99 SA2 saves, despite mathematically being capable of holding more. Lastly, WTA Tour Tennis, along with Disney Sports Soccer and Skateboarding, don't recognise the memory card at all, with Nintendo recommending players use the old memory card models instead. With memory cards alone, Nintendo managed to demonstrate the dangers of what we leave behind during the forward march of progress. We cannot truly evolve if Disney Sports Soccer isn't along for the ride, is what we're saying here. People like to talk about some of the negative things that Nintendo has done over the years, which definitely includes the fact that we wouldn't have been able to make this video even just like 6 years ago. Regardless, Nintendo has put plenty of positives into the world too. Whether it's former President Iwata's decision to take a pay cut in order to protect Nintendo's employees, or their commitment to creating games filled with imagination and joyful optimism. Also, they do a lot for charity. Something Nintendo did that has seemingly been lost to time, however, is their commitment to fostering game development talent in the UK during the GameCube era. In 2003, Nintendo partnered with the console manufacturer SN Systems to give 4 universities in the UK GameCube dev kits, allowing development on this iconic console to become part of the students' core curriculum. You know, game dev students specifically, of course, because art history students weren't being forced to crunch to develop some students' side-scrolling platformer. The 4 institutes in question were the University of Hull, the University of Abertay, the University of Northumbria, and Liverpool John Moores University, and would have marked the students' first time developing on a more up-to-date console. Nowadays, learning about game development via higher education is a lot more common, but in 2003, Nintendo were serious about creating the next generation of excellent game developers. Anyone who's discussed the amazing games that have been released on the Nintendo GameCube will likely have spoken about the Capcom 5. As the name suggests, this was a collection of 5 games Capcom were releasing, all of which were overseen by Resident Evil director Shinji Mikami. Some of these were slated to be GameCube exclusive, but most found their way to other platforms eventually, though the real story of the Capcom 5 is that only 4 of the games, Beautiful Joe, PN03, Killer 7, and a little game by the name of Resident Evil 4 were ever released. The question is, what happened to that 5th game? Titled Dead Phoenix, this 5th project is the one stain on the otherwise wonderful Capcom 5 legacy. Oh come on, PN03 was good. It was fine. It was good enough. Details about Dead Phoenix are thin on the ground, as it would seem that the project was cancelled before too much development had taken place. However, enough work had been put into the game for videos to surface in the years since. In a fantasy world with dragons and demons, you control a mysterious winged protagonist who's shooting his way through the hordes of enemies. With the winged lead character and plenty of firepower, comparisons could be drawn to the Capcom coin-up shooter Legendary Wings, so maybe Dead Phoenix was a spiritual success to that game, but we'll never know for sure. Capcom have never properly acknowledged this lost GameCube title's cancellation, and the trademark reportedly lapsed long ago, meaning this one isn't rising from the ashes anytime soon. You could put together a pretty good video on cancelled Capcom games over the years. Deep down, is that something you'd want to see? Let us know down below. If you're a European, or you've built yourself a nice collection of PAL region games, you will probably notice a coloured triangle at the bottom of the spine of your GameCube game. Far from looking weird or trying to ruin the colour scheme the developers were aiming for on the front cover, these coloured triangles actually serve a really legitimate purpose that's pretty clever if we're being honest. Basically, because Europe as a whole is a multilingual melting pot of cultures, which includes Wales, the best country in the world, Nintendo utilised the coloured triangles as a shorthand for warehouse workers to determine what games were meant to be sent to certain countries. Most PAL games included options for English, French, Spanish, Italian and German, but those triangles helped ensure games with the proper covers for each country were sent to the right place, while also taking into account countries like Portugal and the entirety of Scandinavia, which required their own localization. We already know what you're about to say, and yes, the triangle method had actually been utilised since the NES era, with a triangle found on the spine of a game's manual, but the GameCube marked the first time the triangle was found on the outer case, a method that Nintendo still employs to this day. It's not often that a console manufacturer has to stop making consoles, unless you happen to be a Game Boy competitor in the 2000s of course, but in the case of Nintendo, they were forced to halt the production of the GameCube in just 2003. These days, a console halting being manufactured would likely be due to some kind of chip or material shortage, or some kind of crisis in the world preventing parts from getting to where they need to be, like a ship getting stuck in a canal, like they do once a season. Nintendo in 2003 suffered none of those downfalls though, instead choosing to halt production of the GameCube for a couple of months simply because they were making more than they could sell. Ugh. At the time, then President Satoru Iwata stated that the reason why the GameCube wasn't selling well is because people wanted less sophisticated games. Specifically, Iwata claimed that some games take months to finish, so people are buying less of them, with Iwata quoted as saying, "This trend is clear to everyone and the trend continues this year." Meanwhile though, Final Fantasy X-2 launched in 2003 and managed to sell 2 million copies in Japan alone. We're not trying to say Iwata was a liar or anything, as Mario Kart Double Dash also managed to achieve a great amount of success that same year, but that emerging complexity of games was what made the medium so exciting in the early to mid 2000s. Was Super Mario 128 ever real, or was it the greatest psyop that Nintendo and Miyamoto ever committed on the unsuspecting gaming public? Originally the name for a Super Mario 64 follow-up for the 64DD before that was shelved, the 128 name resurfaced for a tech demo shown during the GameCube reveal at Space World 2000. Instead of just being 64 doubled, the demo took 128 literally, showing over 100 Marios running around a spherical surface at the same time. However, 128 would then pretty much completely disappear, with Super Mario Sunshine being revealed the year afterwards, though Nintendo always maintained that the development of Sunshine and 128 were separate. However, that tech demo would be the last anyone would see of Super Mario 128, bar one cheeky reference to it as an event match in Super Smash Bros. Melee. Nintendo and Miyamoto would always insist that Super Mario 128 was still in development throughout the GameCube's lifecycle. Miyamoto would even claim in 2005 that Super Mario 128 had actually played a large role in the creation of the Wii, with Wii even being developed around this game in question. Flash cut to 2007 and Miyamoto's GDC keynote address when the Mad Dad would say the following: "The one question I'm always asked is, what happened to Mario 128? Most of you already played it in a game called Pikmin." He even stated that the free-flowing level design also inspired Super Mario Galaxy, but none of these plug the Super Mario 128 sized hole in our heart. We mentioned the online capabilities of the GameCube earlier, or the almost lack thereof, as the entire functionality is propped up by the existence of Phantasy Star Online Episodes 1 and 2. Sega's iconic MMO series might not have the same cultural impact today as it once did, but 20 to 25 years ago, Phantasy Star Online was the byword in online console gaming. Still, every good MMO needs to support a keyboard of some kind. Fortunately for those in Japan, you were covered there too, as this absolute monstrosity would allow you to slay ads and chat shit all at once. The ASCII keyboard controller is exactly as the name implies, with some clever or psychotic manufacturers essentially slicing a GameCube controller down the middle and shoving a standard keyboard into the gap. The keyboard supports both Roman lettering and hiragana, making it useful outside of Japan too, so naturally the controller has become somewhat of a collector's item over the years. Combine that with the fact that Phantasy Star Online Episodes 1 and 2 still have a fairly active player base in 2024, supported by community-led private servers, and you might just be able to use this big silly controller for its intended purpose. You know, if you can afford to buy the thing anyway, jeez. Look, we promise that we don't go into writing these facts videos every time wanting to talk about 3D, it just so happens to be that a lot of 3D related technology pops up whenever we research a console. Don't blame us, blame the guys who kept thinking that 3D was cool, which turns out to be everyone in charge of consoles pretty much and ever. Anyway, Nintendo's love of 3D is well documented, considering they made it a core selling point for their DS follow-up, the 3DS. But the 3DS was far from Nintendo's first attempt at getting the third dimension of gaming off the ground. In fact, according to Satoru Iwata in 2011, plans were in motion to make the GameCube Nintendo's first ever 3D capable console, beating the competition to the punch by a wide margin. Well, I guess if you want to discredit Sly Cooper 3 on PS2's stereoscopic 3D, the only thing that stopped it from happening on the GameCube wasn't even the 3D itself. According to Iwata, the GameCube was built with 3D compatible circuitry anyway, meaning the console was designed to support 3D from the get-go. However, in order to make use of the console's 3D, you'd need to fit a certain LCD screen that would have been sold separately, but that accessory never released. As Iwata put it, we couldn't have done it without selling it for a price far above that of the GameCube system itself. Iwata goes on to say that Nintendo did have a working prototype for Luigi's Mansion running in 3D, so it's a shame that this accessory never saw the light of day. We came close though, as in 2023, Go Nintendo discovered footage from E3 2002 of Nintendo proudly showcasing a portable LCD screen accessory for the GameCube. Hey gang, did you know that if you hold some buttons down when turning on the console, it makes funny noises? Oh, you did know that, everyone knows that. Well, try this one on for size. After you've booted up the Nintendo GameCube and you're plonked into the console's system menu, you'll hear an iconic, ethereal sounding piece of music. It might be childhood nostalgia talking, but whenever we hear it, we feel a bit safer, you know? Maybe that's because playing a GameCube means you'll never have to see that dreaded PS2 red screen, but we digress. The music sounds futuristic, almost space-like, but there's not really a melody to it as such, or so you'd think anyway. Dedicated internet sleuths have actually figured out that the music hides an Easter egg you probably don't know. The Easter egg itself can't actually be experienced on the console, but instead requires you to crank the music to around 16 times speed. In doing so, you'll actually hear the same notes as the Famicom Disk System's startup sound. The discovery dates back to around 15 years ago, with multiple videos on YouTube showcasing the similarities between the two songs. It's a kinda bizarre yet incredibly interesting Easter egg that makes you wonder what other references or leitmotifs are hiding in different pieces of gaming music. Like this one. Number 12, Half-Life was on the GameCube, sort of. It's a pretty well-known fact that Nintendo struggled with consistent third-party support for the GameCube, and one huge game that skipped the console entirely was Half-Life. Valve's exquisite FPS experience had already blown PC owners away in the late 90s before being ported to the PS2 and almost the Dreamcast before the dream fell apart, but no GameCube release happened. Or, to be fair, on the OG Xbox either. A lot of people think it did, but it didn't. However, we did get something from Half-Life on the GameCube. Kind of. One of the most celebrated aspects of Half-Life is the soundtrack, with Diabolical Adrenaline Guitar perhaps taking the crown as the most iconic track, but Namco might have used the same samples used in that track for their racing game, Smashing Drive. What's Smashing Drive, you ask? Well, it's not very smashing at all. An arcade racer from 2000 that was unfortunately ported to the GameCube and Xbox in 2002, Smashing Drive's first music track the ironically brilliant early bird contains some riffs that seem to also appear in Diabolical Adrenaline Guitar. Maybe it's just us who'd like to imagine Gordon Freeman being whisked around New York in a game that can basically be described as competitive Crazy Taxi, but it's definitely an amusing thought. The GameCube Game Boy Advance cable, which is quite hard to say out loud if you've never done so in your life before, was probably the most well-known and popular accessory for the GameCube, especially considering that LCD screen didn't pan out, and yes, we're still thinking about it. The cable allowed both Nintendo's consoles to hook up with each other, and while the cable's mere existence is a well-trodden fact at this point, it's interesting to discuss what the cable could actually do. Certain games would require linking up to a companion game, with Mario Golf Toadstool Tour pairing with Advance Tour, allowing the player to import their Advance Tour player character while also unlocking Luigi, Bowser, Wario and Waluigi, while linking Metroid Fusion with Metroid Prime would unlock a Fusion-inspired suit in Metroid Prime. What's more interesting is how many link cable games didn't require a GBA companion game and still offered some kind of bonus or new way of interacting with the game. Animal Crossing allowed players to create custom patterns on their GBA, or access a virtual pet-style minigame, while channel favourite Billy Hatchet and the Giant Egg included minigames based on Choo Choo Rocket, Nights into Dreams and Puyo Pop. Perhaps the most outwardly useful iteration of it came with the original Splinter Cell trilogy, which allowed players to use their GBA as a minimap or radar during play, which is a pretty cool early example of second screen gaming. It'd take 10 years for Xbox to try and approach that kind of interactivity with Smart Glass, and absolutely nobody remembers Smart Glass. It was kind of neat in Dead Rising 3 though, right? We all remember where we were when the World Wrestling Federation, aka Vince McMahon's House of Nightmare Halloween Mirrors, was brought down by a bunch of pandas, but you might be wondering what the specifics of copyright and trademark law have to do with facts about the GameCube. Turns out the GameCube actually played host to the last ever WWF release, that game being WWF WrestleMania X8. Of all the wrestling games to mark a transition from WWF to WWE, WrestleMania X8 is perhaps the most pick of them all. At least the follow-up, WrestleMania 19, had the absolutely unhinged revenge mode where you decide to get revenge on Vince McMahon by eating security dudes into oblivion. Of course, the other path to revenge would have been to wait 20 years and watch him self-destruct. At least you didn't have to wait for closer to 30 years though. Wrestling games typically launch out of season, whether it be due to changes in a wrestler's music, updates to the show's production, or wrestlers joining and leaving specific companies. However, in the case of WrestleMania X8, the entire game was completed before the results of the lawsuit, but was ultimately released after, so the packaging still bore the WWF name despite the fact that the company got the F out. Reprinted versions of WrestleMania X8 soon hit the market, with updated WWE branding on the cover and on the Raw and SmackDown arenas, but the WWF branding could still be found in other areas. As a bonus fact, following Stone Cold Steve Austin taking his bull and going home, the EU and Japan versions of WrestleMania X8 had a bonus reprint with The Rock on the cover. Hulk Hogan was on all versions though, and that's definitely aged very well, hasn't it? Back in the 2000s, video games were obsessed with the idea of trying to put you in the game itself. EA Sports games were particularly bad for it, using a system they termed as Game Face to let players upload images of their own face to place on their own character. Similar systems were available in games like Tony Hawk's Underground and others, and by and large they were all naff or nightmarish. Anyone who remembers the pain of trying to join dots to your own facial features only to be told that the photos were unusable or some other crap because you are some Eldritchian abomination will tell you that they hope to see the person who came up with the feature tarred and feathered. Well, Nintendo had plans to join this cursed group with a game by the name of Stage Debut. Designed to pair with a Game Boy Advance Game Eye camera, itself a spiritual successor to the original Game Boy's camera, Stage Debut would ask players to take pictures of their face to then be imprinted on some basic 3D models. These in-game versions of actual people would then interact with characters from across Nintendo's vast library, including the Animal Crossing villager, Pikmin from Pikmin, and of course Mario and the gang. If you're wondering what the hell the Game Eye is, don't worry. Plans for the camera were shelved completely, with the only traces of stage debut left being a handful of videos and screenshots. After looking at the footage though, perhaps Nintendo were completely right to mothball this one. Some of these characters look haunting. A United States study discovered that the Wii Remote's ability to demand delicate, finely tuned movements could be a practical way to increase a surgeon's preparation for the operating theatre. In particular, the game Marble Mania and its objective of guiding a ball through a 3D maze was found to be a good way to brush up on the fundamentals of precision and steadiness in surgery. The game offered physical challenges related to keyhole surgery in particular, which involves utilising small cuts and sometimes even a camera to diagnose and treat patients. But that's not the only time a scientific study suggested the Wii had potential in this arena. A 2013 study concluded its findings by stating the Nintendo Wii might be a helpful, inexpensive and entertaining part of the training of young laparoscopists, in addition to a standard surgical education based on simulators and the operating room. Neat. We could have had a lot of fun with this reference a year ago, but the embers of time wait for no man, or whatever the saying is. Hey, speaking of embers, you might look at that little bar that helps you sail through the stars in Super Mario Galaxy or send you to sleep in Link's Crossbow Training and think that it's a thing of magic. While the Wii was certainly ahead of its time in some ways, the tech behind it is wonderfully kinda simple. The truth is, anything that gives off the infrared light your Wii Remote needs to communicate will do the trick, but two T-lights placed evenly apart seems to work the best. While it's true that you can use two candles to simulate the sensor that allows your Nintendo Wii Remote to function, it's also true that this can be a very quick way to treat yourself to some nasty burns, especially if your brain hasn't fully formed yet. This was the case for at least one child in 2012, and while people are still discovering the magic of infrared light bulbs and electronics, it's hard to imagine that only one person has ever experienced an accident while playing Wii Sports or a Red Steel 2 in this style. The Ammanford Carmarthenshire child from Wales, the greatest country in the world, would need skin grafts for the 8% burn sustained to his chest. Not great. Using the candles is a neat party trick, just again, try not to burn the damn house down. One of the ways in which the Wii defined itself as a console to be shared with friends and family, your Mii could do all sorts of things, including participate in numerous games. We all remember trying to take on Matt, who himself was probably modelled on Terry Crews based on the arse whoopings he'd hand out. A lot of people know that the Wii was the brainchild of Shigeru Miyamoto, with the actual Mii creation process being spearheaded by designers like Yamashita Takayuki. But what people may not know is that Miyamoto had this concept in his back pocket for 2 full decades. In a 2007 GDC keynote speech, Miyamoto revealed a Famicom demo he had come up with in which players could draw faces onto avatars. While not the fully realised Mii concept that would become part of the Wii years later, the concept intrigued Miyamoto despite not having an actual game to put the idea in. Avatar creation would resurface in other consoles, including the Nintendo 64 and the Nintendo GameCube, but it would take the development of the Wii to finally bring the idea to the mainstream. Miis are still a feature of the Switch, but Nintendo really hasn't made it half as big a deal as it was on the Wii, and that's a shame. They didn't even do the obvious thing and make a Miitopia. Come on guys, it's right there, you can have that one for free. There's a lot of benefit of hindsight stories in video games, such as Sega rejecting a collaboration proposal with Sony that certainly didn't come back to haunt them at all. Sony themselves, along with Microsoft, had a pretty similar experience when both companies rejected the motion control tech that would eventually power the Wii's meteoric rise to success. In fact, according to inventor Tom Quinn, the meeting with Microsoft went so badly, an executive apologized to him afterwards for the apparent rudeness of his colleagues. It didn't go much better at Sony, where PlayStation 1 creator Ken Kutaragi apparently closed his eyes at the beginning of Quinn's presentation and didn't open them again until the presentation finished. Ouch. That's a bit much really, but I am suddenly picturing him falling asleep while dreaming of C12 Final Resistance. as we all do. Nintendo, on the other hand, was far more receptive. Purchasing a small stake in Quinn's company granted them a license, which Nintendo then utilised in the creation of the Wii, and the rest is history. Sorry. Sony and Microsoft, meanwhile, would basically copy Nintendo's homework with the Move and Kinect respectively, the former never really getting too much traction, but the latter hit it big with the casual market to the point where Xbox tried to revolve their entire next generation around that market. Viewers, it did not go well. While Nintendo are no stranger to suing people or being sued themselves, the revolutionary Wii Remote came under a particularly harsh level of scrutiny from a slew of companies, all of which believed they were the true inventors or copyright holders of the technology used in the remotes. By our count, no less than 4 major companies have brought lawsuits against Nintendo for the Wii Remote. Interlink Electronics kicked off the first one in December 2006, only to have the suit tossed out in March of the following year. Hillcrest Laboratories would fare a bit better in 2008 with a suit that was eventually settled out of court, the terms of which have never been made public, so Then, Think Optics sued Nintendo in 2011 for violating its patents with the remote, extending the suit to the Wii U as well. Did it not suffer enough before being dismissed in 2014? Finally, in 2012, iLife Technologies sued a number of companies for alleged patent infringements, including Nintendo, winning a jury ruling in 2017 that would be upheld by the US Court of Appeals in December of that year. The original judgment was then overturned quite recently in 2020, which was 4 years ago. What the hell? Claiming their patent was too broad. 4 years. Crikey. Nintendo can't get any luck with their controllers apparently, as they have been getting into a lot of bother for Joy-Con drift on the Switch, though 2 class action lawsuits were recently thrown out against them. They should celebrate by releasing a brand new F-Zero game, if you ask us. Bonus sad fact, the Wii was the first home console that a new F-Zero game did not appear on since its inception as a series. Outrageous. It's easy to make a lot of bad financial decisions once you buy a Wii, especially if you fall into the Just Dance extended universe. But the Wii could also help you with your budget too. In the UK in 2014, when the console had already been discontinued for nearly a year, weirdly, the Conservative government tried to use the Nintendo Wii to help citizens get the information and assistance they needed regarding their universal credit benefits. Despite a rollout program that didn't seem to go especially great, the Department for Work and Pensions tried to get the word out in as many ways as possible. Information on an individual's benefits could be accessed on select digital TVs, with the Wii becoming part of that in 2014, even though the Wii U was already out and the Wii was discontinued. It was the hope of the government that the Wii could help bridge the considerable gap between program benefit information and the fact that more than 7 million people in the UK didn't have easy access to the internet. Was the measure successful though? Well, we honestly couldn't say, as you don't tend to get reviews for government programs online, but as the TV information channels received some 30,000 hits by the time the Wii U was added, it's likely that the Wii really did help some people out financially. When it comes to the Miis, we're talking about something that arguably gave the Wii a lot of its personality. That and the shop channel music, which we're going to be brave and not play for the first time ever in a Wii YouTube video. Oh, go on then, just a second. Where would the console be without all of its many weird little dudes? Tens of millions of personalized avatars were created by Wii owners and players, but one Mii in particular was created for completely different reasons. In 2009, it was reported that Japanese police used the Mii creation feature to design a visual impression of a young man being sought in connection with a hit and run. That's not very cool. Police decided to forego the usual tactics of police artists or using Photoshop software, instead creating a Mii based on the description they had and combining that with a real photograph of the car involved in the hit and run. Spearheaded by officers in the Kanagawa prefecture, it's unknown if the unusual measure actually worked. We're inclined to guess though that it didn't, since seemingly no one else has ever tried to do it with a Mii, but it did get Nintendo another Guinness World Record, so that's exciting, isn't it? Who knows what would have become of the Zodiac Killer if the Wii was around back then though? Who knows? Wii Sports no doubt went a long way towards making the system a hit, although it could be argued that it was maybe too early a peak for the system as far as casual players were concerned. It's the Ocarina of Time of party games, really. However, the decision to bundle Wii Sports with the Wii itself wasn't something Nintendo knew they were going to do from the beginning. In his 2022 book, Disrupting the Game from the Bronx to the Top of Nintendo, former Nintendo president and CEO Reggie Fils-Aimé detailed that the decision to bundle Wii Sports in every region except Japan was the result of several challenging meetings with management, with Shigeru Miyamoto in particular being dead set against releasing the game, offering an early version of Wii Play as the packing game instead, and telling both Reggie and Mike Fukada, "Neither of you understands the challenges of creating software that people love to play. This is something we constantly push ourselves to do. We do not give away our software." Thankfully, as Fils-Aimé's book emphasizes, such disagreements were infrequent and always respectful, and Nintendo did in fact give away their software to the tune of 100 million Wii units sold. A good trade-off, wouldn't you say? Nintendo has a history of putting little nods back to their history into the menus of their consoles, so it's fascinating to discover the origins behind the Wii's quirky "why not take a break" screen was inspired by the 1995 SNES RPG Earthbound. While a lot of us remember the screen with varying levels of fondness or irritation when you're balls deep in Phase 4 of the Just Dance extended universe, you may not know that the origins behind the screen were revealed in the touching 2021 book Ask Iwata, Words of Wisdom from Satoru Iwata, Nintendo's legendary CEO. In a discussion between Iwata, Earthbound creator Shigesato Itoi, and Yasuhiro Nagata, sorry for the name gore there, Itoi mentioned Iwata being flummoxed by his decision to include a feature in which the father of Earthbound's protagonist Nesk asked the player if they wanted to take a break at the 2-hour mark. In the same conversation, Nagata teasingly mentioned that Iwata himself reused the idea for the Nintendo Wii years later. "That's right," Iwata said laughingly in the interview. "Mr. Itoi's idea of adding a 2-hour dad had at some point taken hold of me, and I wound up adding something similar to the Wii." Nice stuff. Selling for approximately $663 USD on a Japanese auction site through Yahoo Auctions, the 2018 emergence of what was essentially a Wii Remote built for the GameCube came as a great shock to many. Even those who understood the evolution of the controller were surprised by just how closely this GameCube remote resembles the final product. However, it's not that the Wii Remote was originally made specifically for the GameCube, but rather it was a prototype for Nintendo's next-gen console that was made to be tested on what was then Nintendo's current console. This is why the controller, bundled with a sensor bar and an early version of what would eventually become the Nunchuck, was made to be used with a GameCube developer kit, but there was no candles, unfortunately. While Nintendo would go through a few different design concepts for the Wii Remote, it's cool to see that even from the beginning, the Wii was taking Nintendo in a new direction. Could you imagine how much that remote would sell for now in a post-lockdown retro market though? Crikey, we could probably finance the Mad World remaster the world needs by ourselves, people. While it didn't have as many cool cancelled games as the N64, the Wii still saw numerous announced titles that either later came out for a different system or were completely abandoned. Some of these games, including Metroid Tactics, Star Fox Zero, and the first Kid Icarus game in 2 decades, could have further defined the system as one of the greatest of all time. A Wii exclusive sequel to Wave Race Blue Storm would have been pretty sweet as well. It's been way too long since we saw that series. With some of these unreleased games, things never got past the experimentation stage. This was true of Star Fox Zero, which wasn't specifically developed for the Wii, but rather the Wii U with material from a Wii Star Fox game that never happened. Metroid Tactics, meanwhile, was pitched as a turn-based tactical series in the vein of XCOM, and yeah, it's a damn shame that never came to fruition either. The most unfortunate cancelled third-party Wii game arguably was Dragon's Crown. Amazingly, Dragon's Crown originally began as a Dreamcast game, but for a variety of reasons struggled through a hellishly long production period before finally getting released for the PS3 and Vita in 2013, with it remaining locked to PlayStation ever since. We were also supposed to get a Wii version of Garfield Gets Real. What could have been? In terms of gigabytes, the three largest Nintendo Wii games on record are Metroid Prime Trilogy, Metroid Other M, and Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Right, remember those numbers because it's important to have something to compare to when we tell you the smallest Wii game ever released on a disc, an almost completely straight port of the 1993 SNES release Super Mario All-Stars, came in at a staggering 0.03 gigabytes. That, guys, is 30 megabytes. For reference, that's like 6 Hoobastank songs and leaves 99.7% of the disk used to store the game completely unused. Worse yet, this isn't a port of the version of Super Mario All-Stars that included Super Mario World. We've got the 3 mainline NES games, the Japan-exclusive sequel that was eventually released worldwide as The Lost Levels, and that is it. No in-game special features or improvements of any kind, really. The limited edition release of the game included a soundtrack and booklet to commemorate the 25th anniversary of Mario, and that was enough for some to justify charging full price for a game that also has the distinction of being one of only a couple Wii games that doesn't require the disc to remain in the console in order to work, because the SNES ROM on the disc is so small that it is loaded into the RAM of the Wii itself. Certain questions can't help but haunt humanity, like ketchup or catsup. No quandary better fits this fact than where Mario Kart's iconic Rainbow Road can be found in the real world, as our real, sadly F-Zero-less world is visible from certain parts of the track across the different games. But where exactly? Well, somebody really did go out and come up with a canonical answer, and that answer varies from one version of Mario Kart to the next. Super Mario Broth, an excellent account you really should be following if you can tolerate Twitter these days, which you better person than me, discovered that Rainbow Road's location in Mario Kart Wii is different from the location of Rainbow Road in Mario Kart 8 on Wii U. So where do you have to go for Mario Kart Wii? By examining the skyboxes, you'll see that it matches up with a decent chunk of Canada. The track is quite large in comparison to Earth, with much of the track covering northeastern Canada, particularly Quebec. There's a small portion of the track that overlaps Greenland, which is where we're assuming they're keeping that Mad World remaster. By comparison, Mario Kart 8's Rainbow Road is much smaller than the Earth and can be found along part of the Mediterranean Sea. That'll be a bit harder to walk though. Bonus Simpsons fact: ketchup, catsup, same thing. Catsup is just what it's called in places like Mexico. The Wii was officially discontinued in late 2013, but the Wii Shop continued to run until 2019, and Nintendo themselves continued to offer repair support for the system until early 2020, citing a scarcity in the necessary spare parts. Now that might sound like they went above and beyond there, but this is nothing new from a company whose support for its original Famicom in Japan didn't end until 2007. Despite the Wii ceasing production in 2013, several companies simply continued to release games for the next 7 years. For reference, this is kinda like the PS4 stopping production today, but still getting games until 2031. Given the massive number of consoles that were sold and the system's value for exercise and fitness, it just made sense to publishers like Ubisoft for them to keep giving the system new Just Dance installments until, you're about to hear us correctly, the year 2019 with Just Dance 2020. Let's Sing from Voxler also came out on the Wii that year, with the last game coming to the Wii in 2019. Those are both kind of wild, but they're not the wildest examples, as both Retro City Rampage DX and Shakedown Hawaii got physical releases in 2020 exclusively in Europe. Any fandom can be a mixed bag, especially if the person they idolise happens to occasionally play a guitar and sing about their 15 evil exes, or happens to pick on how many words I mispronounce all the time. Leave me alone. But you can't deny that when fans of anything combine their resources for something positive, it can be a force for good. Such is the story of Operation Rainfall, also known as just Oprainfall, which would become such a massive campaign to bring select Japanese Wii releases to the US, Europe and beyond, that Nintendo President Reggie Fils-Aimé would reference the fan effort in an interview. Operation Rainfall started in 2011 by making a push to get localizations and releases for Xenoblade Chronicles, The Last Story and Pandora's Tower. Nintendo will never outright say how much of an influence the campaign actually had, but we would imagine it was substantial, even if Reggie knew that 100,000 signatures doesn't mean 100,000 sales. All three games would do admirably with critics and sales on the console, with Xenoblade in particular going on to become a core pillar for Nintendo, and Nintendo Wii fans outside of Japan had 3 more excellent reasons to support the system. What people may not know though is that Operation Rainfall is kinda still going on now, with it being a news blog since 2015 that highlights niche games. Neat. Outro gang, unexpected Jimmy fact time. I didn't actually know how to say words with the sounds in them, TH, for my entire life. Until I started doing this channel and started getting really angry comments from Americans who really care about that. And so for the last year or so I've been doing speech therapy so that I can say my the, so I can say the difference between 3 and 3. There you go. It doesn't matter, I'll admit to it here because none of you got to this outro, but if you did get to this outro, be sure to comment down below your 3, Jimmy, so the number 3, and I'll get you a Steam key. If you want to see a compilation for PlayStation facts, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 3, 4, maybe even 5, put your comments down below and I'll read them and then I'll do something with them, probably. I've been Jimmy, been good to have you, and thanks for watching.